Midnight. The old dog barks once short, certain, and then nothing. Lantern light drags across the barn wall. Behind the hay bales, he hasn't broken down for winter feed. There is a wool blanket that does not belong to this place. And beneath that blanket, something is breathing. Outside, the cold comes down off the northern ridgeline flat and mean, the kind that doesn't bother with wind because it doesn't need to. Small boots show at the edge of the blanket. The snow packed on them lies in layers. Not fresh. 4 miles of dark road in a soul already pulling loose from the upper. Down in the valley, a man already knew this woman's name before she stepped off the train. And in the ledger on the kitchen table of that house, one date has been rewritten in a hand that does not belong to the man who signed it. He lowers the lantern so the light won't hit her face. Her eyes open. No panic. No startle. And before he can arrange a single question, the land did not welcome you in Harrow Valley. It simply allowed you to exist on it, and only for as long as you proved worth the trouble. The San Juan foothills had a way of running the weak ones out before the first winter finished. Not through cruelty exactly, and through indifference. The mountains didn't care whether you stayed or left. The creek didn't adjust its course for your convenience. And the snow came when it came, and in the quantity it decided. And a man either built himself into the landscape, or he became another abandoned claim stake, rusting in the spring mud. And Carter Hale had been proving his worth for 22 years. He moved along the fence line in the last hour before midnight, boots breaking through the crust of packed snow, with a sound like something's being decided. And the cold came in off the northern ridgeline and hit flat and mean, the kind that didn't bother with wind because it didn't need to. It was enough on its own. And Carter was large enough that the cold had to work harder on him than on other men, had to find the gaps in his canvas coat and push through the worn flannel beneath, and had to work at the back of his neck, where the collar never quite sat right against skin that had been weathered the color of old saddle leather, and he let it. The discomfort was something to pay attention to, and paying attention to something kept a man from paying attention to nothing, which was the only thing waiting for him back inside the house. He stopped at the northwest post, and the one that leaned 3 degrees off true, no matter how many times he reset it. The post was a problem, he understood. He wrapped his gloved hands around it, tested its resistance, felt the frozen ground holding it in a grip that wouldn't give until the spring thaw. And he let go, left it for tomorrow, like every other tomorrow before this one. The ranch spread out behind him in the dark, and he knew every foot of it without looking. 840 acres, running from the base of the ridge down to the flat, where Bristle Creek bent east. And the creek was the reason Silas Drum had ridden out 3 times in 4 months. Each time with a better offer, each time with a smile that didn't quite make it past his teeth. And the creek fed the lower pastures through July and August, when every other water source in the valley went dry, and the smaller operations were selling cattle at distress prices, or hauling water by wagon from the river 12 miles south. And Carter's cattle made it through dry summers because of that water. Without it, the ranch was acreage with grass and a view. With it, the ranch was the only operation in Harrow Valley that could run a full herd year-round without supplementing. And Drum knew this the same way. He knew everything useful about other people's property. Carter turned back toward the house and walked the perimeter in the dark, the way he had walked it every night for 3 years. Not because the fence needed inspection at midnight, but because the house had a shape at this hour that he couldn't sit inside. 2 stories of hewn timber and mortared stone that Hannah had loved before she understood how isolated it truly was, before the winter showed her what isolation really meant in the San Juan foothills. And she had not complained. That was not her nature. And she had hung curtains in the front windows and braided rugs for the floor and learned to bake bread in the altitude. And she had loved the view of the mountains in the morning with a sincerity that made Carter feel, and every time he watched her watch them, and that he had done at least one right thing in his life. And she was gone 3 years now, and the curtains were still there. And he had not been able to take them down. Not because he expected her back, because taking them down would require standing at the window with his hands on the rod and pulling, and he had not yet found the particular arrangement of reasons that made that action possible. And so the curtains stayed, and the house held its shape around them. And every evening Carter went outside and walked the fence line until the cold gave him something else to think about. He went inside through the back door, stomping snow from his boots on the porch boards, and the house received him the way it always did. Quiet. Warm from the banked fire he'd built before going out. And the smell of the coffee he'd left on the stove, and the older smell underneath it. The one that lived in the timbers and the rugs and the spaces between things. The smell of someone who used to be here. He sat at the desk beneath the front window. And the lamp he lit threw a circle of yellow over the scarred wood, over the ledger of ranch expenses, over the 2 letters he needed to answer and hadn't. He opened the bottom drawer. And he did this every night at this hour, and had done it for going on 2 years, and he had not found a way to stop doing it that didn't require a reason to stop. Inside the drawer was a single folded sheet. The paper had gone soft at the creases from handling, and the ink faded at the margins, where his grip had worn the fibers thin over months of nightly unfolding and folding back. He took it out and read it the way he always did. Not because the words had changed, and because they hadn't, and there was some comfort in that, and he was not proud of needing that particular comfort. But he had stopped arguing with himself about it somewhere in the second winter. The letter said what it said, and a man named Carter Hale, a ranch near Harrow Valley, Custer County, Colorado. A widower, not looking for a servant or a saint, looking for someone who didn't mind quiet, who might stay. And the handwriting was his own, careful in the way his handwriting always was, the hand of a man who had learned to write late and still treated each letter as something worth forming correctly. And he had written it the night the silence had made itself so large he could feel it pressing on his sternum, and written it with some idea that the act of writing was a thing separate from the act of sending, that he could put the words outside himself without putting them into the world. He had folded the letter and put it in the drawer and not sent it. And somewhere in the months that followed it had become a kind of nightly proof that the feeling existed, that he had felt it, that at least once he had tried to say what he needed, even if he'd never said it to anyone who could answer. And he folded it and put it back, closed the drawer. Outside, the wind had picked up from nothing and found some tooth in the dark and was pushing against the timber walls, with a sound like a large animal walking the perimeter. And Carter listened to it for a moment, and then rose, and turned down the lamp, and climbed the stairs to the bed he had not moved to the center of in 3 years. And he did not sleep for a long time, and he was still awake when Flint barked. One bark, short, the kind that meant discovery, not alarm. And Flint was a cattle dog, and 11 years old, and gray around the muzzle now, and half deaf in the left ear, but still sharp enough where it counted. And he had long since learned to distinguish between a threat and a surprise. Threats got sustained, low warning, the kind that raised every hair on the back of your neck and sent your hand toward the rifle on its hooks by the door. And surprises got that single declarative sound, and then silence, while he waited to see what the surprise would do next. Carter was out of bed and pulling on his boots before the bark had finished echoing. He didn't think about it. And he had lived long enough with the particular rhythms of this property that certain sounds bypassed thought entirely and went straight to his legs. And he laced the boots without lighting the lamp, and pulled his flannel shirt on over the undershirt he'd slept in, and shrugged into the heavy canvas coat hanging by the bedroom door, and took the oil lantern from its hook in the hallway. And he lit it at the top of the stairs, turned the wick low, and went out into the snow. The cold was absolute, the kind that hits you in the first second of contact, and then you've made your peace with it, and your body decides what it's going to do. Carter decided to move quickly, and he crossed the yard in the direction of the barn, boots crunching in the dark, the lantern swinging at his side and throwing light in a yellow arc across the snow. And Flint appeared at the barn door, tail moving in small controlled arcs, not worried, waiting, watching Carter's face to see how the situation would be classified. Carter eased the door open. The barn received him with warmth. The 2 horses in their stalls shifted and resettled. And the smell of hay and old wood, and the particular animal warmth of a space where living things had been breathing for hours. He moved the lantern in a slow sweep of the interior and found nothing unusual at first. And tack on its hooks, feed sacks stacked and tied, the farm implements ranked along the far wall, and his late wife's mare Belle, and standing in the near stall with one hip dropped, half asleep, unbothered by the lantern light. And then in the far corner, beyond the stack of hay bales he hadn't yet broken down for winter feed, a shape that did not belong. A person, a woman, curled tight against the corner wall under what appeared to be a wool blanket that was not from this barn. Small boots visible at the edge of the blanket, dark leather, the toe of the left one pulling loose from the sole. A traveling bag of brown leather, battered and stuffed full, buckled shut and tucked against the wall beside her. Flint had settled himself nearby, tail giving one slow wag when Carter looked at him, apparently having decided in the time between his one bark and Carter's arrival that the situation did not require further commentary. Carter stepped forward, keeping the lantern low so the light didn't hit her face too directly. She stirred before he reached her. Not the jolt of someone caught, the slow surfacing of someone accustomed to waking in difficult circumstances and having learned not to startle, because startling cost energy, and energy was not a thing she wasted. Her eyes opened and found him without panic. She took him in, all of him, the full height and breadth of him filling the barn's dim space, the way someone looks at a problem they have anticipated and are now ready to deal with. Then, before he could arrange a question, she said, "I'll go." Her voice was rough from cold or sleep or both, but it was a clear voice, a voice that had not lost its shape even now. She was already pushing herself upright, the blanket falling from her shoulders, and he could see her coat clearly for the first time. Wool dark green, good quality once, the hem frayed, the collar turned up against a cold. It was no longer quite thick enough to stop. She wore a blouse beneath it, high-necked, and a skirt of dark wool that had gone stiff with cold at the hem where it had dragged through snow. Her hair was dark and had come loose from whatever arrangement it had started the day in, pieces of it against her face and her neck. She was not a young woman in the first flush sense. She was a woman who had arrived somewhere past that and was carrying herself with the particular composure of someone who had decided composure was a thing she would maintain regardless of what the world offered her. Carter Hale was not a man given to long appraisals. He had learned young to read situations quickly and accurately because the cost of reading them wrong on a working ranch in the high country was something you only paid once. What he read now, in the 30 seconds it took the woman in his barn to get herself upright and reach for her traveling bag, was this, she was not here to steal from him. She was not dangerous. She was cold past the point where cold was uncomfortable and had moved into the territory where it was simply the condition she was managing. And she was not going to ask him for anything. That last part was what stopped him from simply pointing toward the road. "You know this is my barn," he said, a statement, not a question. He didn't ask questions he already knew the answer to. Yes. She had her hand on the traveling bag, fingers working the buckle. "I saw the name on the gate post when I came in. I only need it out of the wind. I'll be gone before first light." She said this the way you say something you have rehearsed because you have needed it before. The flat delivery of a line that has kept you safe in other barns, other cold places, and so you keep it ready. "You came through the gate. I didn't want to wake anyone." Carter moved the lantern slightly. "Where did you come from?" "The station." The Harrow station was 4 miles from the ranch by the direct road, 4 miles in what had been, when he'd checked the sky at sundown, falling temperatures and a building wind. The snow on her boots was packed in layers, not fresh. She had been walking for some time before she found the barn. He looked at the boots again, the left sole pulling loose from the upper. 4 miles in those boots, on that road in that cold. "Where were you headed?" She looked at him when he asked this, a different look than before. Not defensive, not calculating. The look of someone assessing whether a particular truth will make things better or worse, and apparently deciding it was neutral. "I was looking for someone. A property called the Crane Ranch. And then I was told in town it was Hale. Carter Hale." Carter stood very still. The lantern flame moved in the small current created by his own breathing. "You found him," he said. She went still too, not with relief, with the careful quality of someone who has learned that arrival is not the same as welcome and who will not assume one because they've achieved the other. She looked at him for a moment, then reached into the front of her coat and drew out a folded piece of paper. Held it toward him without speaking. He knew before he took it. From the color of the paper and the way it had been folded, he knew. And he took it and opened it and read his own handwriting by the light of his own lantern in his own barn. And something moved behind his sternum that was too complicated to name at this hour and too present to ignore. And I never sent this, he said. No. She kept her voice even. The woman at the bureau in Denver said the reply must have gone astray. She had the letter on file. She gave it to me and said she thought I seemed suited. A pause. I should have written first. I understand that now. And I didn't think it through as carefully as I should have. He looked at her. Not at the letter. At her. The cold had made her face very clear, the way extreme cold does, cutting away everything inessential and leaving the structure of a person. What was there was a face that had lived in it, that had seen things it hadn't gone looking for, and made its accommodation with them without being destroyed by the accommodation. The eyes were steady, not hard, and there was a difference between those two things, and he knew which one he was looking at. There's a fire inside, he said, and food, if you haven't eaten. Something crossed her expression. Not surprise exactly, and more like the recalibration of an expectation she'd held, and was now finding less accurate than she'd prepared for. And I don't want to put you to trouble. Carter turned toward the barn door with the lantern. You're already here, he heard her pick up the traveling bag. And they crossed the yard in silence, two figures in the dark, the lantern Carter carried, throwing their shadows long across the snow behind them. And he opened the back door and stood aside to let her pass. And she went through it and into the kitchen, and he watched her stop for just a moment when the warmth hit her. And just one breath, the body recognizing what it had been denied. Then she moved to the side of the room and stood there, waiting to be told where to go and not taking anything for herself that hadn't been offered. He built the fire back up from the coals and put a pot on. And he ladled out what was left of the day's stew, a thick one with salt pork, and the last of the autumn's dried beans, and put a piece of cornbread on the side, and set the bowl on the table and poured water from the pitcher. And he did not do any of this with particular ceremony. He did it the way he did all things on the ranch, efficiently and without waste, because it was what the situation required, and he was a man who matched his actions to what situations required. She sat down and ate. And he sat across from her with his coffee and watched the fire and said nothing. It was not an awkward silence. It was the silence of two people who had both spent enough time alone that silence between strangers required no management. And she ate with the focused attention of someone making the food last, without appearing to. The controlled pace of someone who had learned that meals were not guaranteed and had adjusted accordingly without making it anyone else's concern. And when she was finished, she set the spoon down and looked at him. Nora James. He nodded once. How long were you on the train? 2 days from Denver. Before Denver, she held his gaze. That's a longer story than tonight calls for. And he accepted this. Pushed back from the table and took the lamp from the kitchen hook and led her up the stairs to the spare room at the end of the hall. He paused at the door. And the room had Hannah's quilt on the bed and Hannah's small mirror on the dresser, and the rocking chair Hannah had loved, brought up from her mother's house in Pueblo the year they married. He had not changed any of it. He had not been in this room in 8 months. And he stood in the doorway for a moment, not explaining anything, because explaining it would require saying things he hadn't found words for yet. Nora set her traveling bag down inside the door and looked at the quilt and the rocker, and then at him. She did not ask. And she simply looked and understood. In the way perceptive people understand things that haven't been spoken, that this room had belonged to someone else, and that its contents were still arranged the way that person had left them. And thank you, she said. Simple. No performance in it. He nodded and went back down the stairs. He didn't sleep after that. And he lay on his side of the bed and listened to the wind and the settling of the timbers, and somewhere beneath those sounds, the quiet fact of another person breathing on the same property. It was not a large sound. It wasn't a sound at all, really. And it was simply the absence of a particular quality of emptiness he had grown so accustomed to that its absence was itself something to notice. And he noticed it for a long time. At some point he slept. He was up before full light, dressed and downstairs, and at the stove. He heard her boots on the stairs before the coffee had finished. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, in her traveling clothes from the night before. Her hair braided and pinned with the neat efficiency of someone who did this every morning, regardless of circumstances. Her coat in her arms rather than on her body. The traveling bag in her hand. I appreciate the shelter. She was looking at a point somewhere between him and the window, not avoiding his face, organizing herself for what came next. I'll be on my way. Carter poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table, one on his side, one on the other side. He sat down at his and waited. She looked at the cup. Then she looked at the traveling bag in her hand. Then at the cup again. She put the bag down by the door, took off her coat and hung it on the peg beside his, sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside the window, the snow was still coming, the sky a uniform gray that gave nothing away about when it intended to stop. Neither of them said anything about it. After breakfast, he went out to the barn, and she came with him, just following with the self-possession of someone who understood that idle time on a working property in winter was a thing to be filled. He showed her nothing. She simply watched what needed doing and did the parts she could reach. She was not a ranch woman and did not pretend to be, but she was competent and she paid attention and she did not get in the way of the things she didn't know how to help with. Then she found Belle. Carter's late wife's mare was 14 years old and had the particular distrust of strangers common to horses that have had one primary person their whole lives and then lost them. She would take grain from Carter because Carter was the structure of her world now. But she had moved through the 3 years since Hannah's death with a reserve toward everyone else that no amount of patient handling from the ranch hands he hired seasonally had fully cracked. When Nora approached the stall that first morning, she did not put her hand out immediately the way people did when they were trying to make horses trust them. She just stood there, at the edge of the stall door, still, and let Belle look at her. Carter was at the back of the barn reorganizing the feed sacks when he heard it, or didn't hear it. The small sound Belle made when a stranger got too close. The slight shift in breath that meant warning. The precursor to the earback that preceded the real displeasure. Didn't come. He turned around. Nora was still at the stall door, not moving, and Belle had come to the front of the stall on her own and put her nose 6 inches from Nora's shoulder. Just looking, deciding something. Carter turned back to the feed sacks. He did not know what to make of that, but he filed it. He was a man who filed things carefully, because on a working ranch, the things you noticed and remembered were often the things that later told you something important that you would have needed to know. In the afternoon, Nora asked to see the ledger books. Not in those words. What she said was, "Your records from last quarter, the stack on the left side of the desk." "May I look at something?" It was barely a question, more like someone notifying him of their intention and checking for objection. He said nothing, which she correctly read as assent. He was mending tack at the kitchen table when she came back from the desk with the ledger open to the page. He hadn't looked at closely in weeks. She set it in front of him and pointed to the row of figures at the bottom of the October column without speaking. He looked at where her finger was. He looked at the number. He looked at the date beside it. The note on the 30th came due in 6 weeks, not 4 months as he had believed. As the banker in Harrow had, the last time Carter had gone in and asked, told him. 6 weeks. Carter sat with this for a moment. The way you sit with a thing when you need to be certain you've understood it correctly before you respond to it. Something's wrong with that date, he said. Not a question, not denial. Just a man looking at a number and knowing his own agreements well enough to know when one of them had been altered. Either the date in this column is wrong, Nora said, or the date you were told is wrong. One of them was written down incorrectly. She paused, or changed. He looked up at her. She didn't elaborate. She had said what she'd found and offered the available interpretations, and she was letting him reach his own conclusion. She was not the kind of woman who walked a man to his own thinking. She handed him the map and let him read it. Carter closed the ledger. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the cover. He thought about Silas Drum's 3rd visit 3 weeks prior. The polished boots and the tweed vest buttoned over a silk waistcoat, the smile that arrived before the man did. as though Drum had practiced putting it on a quarter-mile from the gate so it would be fully in by arrival. And the offer he'd made, and the most specific one yet, and with numbers and terms and a document folded in his coat pocket, and which he'd produced and laid on Carter's kitchen table without being asked. And Carter had not picked it up. Drum had folded it back into his pocket and said, before he left, that he hoped Carter's winter went smoothly. Smoothly, specifically. A word that acknowledged without naming the thing it acknowledged. And Carter looked at the ledger cover under his hands. And I need to go into town, he said. When you do, Nora said, bring the ledger. He looked at her again. She had already turned and gone back to the desk. He did not go that afternoon. The snow was too fresh, and the road to Harrow would be drifted at the creek crossing. And he would go when the road had been broken by the timber wagon that made the run on Tuesdays. In the meantime, there was work. And that evening, Doc Briggs came. Doc Briggs had been the physician in Harrow for 19 years. And he was a compact man, wiry, in the way of someone who had never stopped moving long enough to put weight on. With gray hair he kept cut close and eyes that had looked at enough human damage to have lost any quality of being surprised by it. And he and Carter had shared a bottle every few months for a decade, the kind of friendship that existed mostly in the form of each man knowing the other well enough to not need to perform anything. And he came in the back door the way he always did, stamping snow from his boots, his medical bag in one hand, and a bottle in the other. He stopped when he saw Nora at the desk. He looked at her, looked at Carter, who was at the stove, looked at Nora again. And he set the bottle on the counter and took off his coat without being asked and sat at the kitchen table with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that the best response to a new situation is to sit down and gather information before forming an opinion. And Doc Briggs, Carter said. Nora James. Nora turned from the desk. Doctor. Miss James. Doc's voice was neutral in the specific way of a man cataloging information before deciding anything about it. He looked at Carter. You might have mentioned. It was recent. And Doc accepted this with a nod, and they sat through one cup of the coffee Carter made, which Doc had been drinking without complaint for a decade, despite it being universally regarded as the worst coffee produced in Custer County. And Nora went back to the desk and worked on something in the ledger. And at some point, Doc leaned slightly toward Carter and said low, and without preamble, and Silas Drum was asking at the station about the woman who came in on the Tuesday train. And Carter looked at his cup. He knew her name, Doc said. Before anyone told him. Carter thought about the note on the 30th. He thought about the smile that arrived before Drum did. And he thought about a man who walked into other people's offices, carrying documents folded in his coat pocket, like he'd already decided how the meeting would end. And he thought about what it meant that Drum had known, specifically, to ask about Nora James by name, before she'd had time to make herself known to anyone in the town. Doc read his silence correctly, the way he always did. I don't know what she is to you, and I don't know what she is to him either. But if Drum has his attention on her, she's in the middle of something he started before she got here. Carter looked across the kitchen at the woman at his desk, and her back to them both, the lamp on the corner of the desk, throwing light across the ledger pages she was turning with careful hands. Her coat was draped over the back of the chair, and the green wool dark against the lamplight, the collar still turned up from habit even in the warmth of the room. He was aware, in a way he hadn't articulated even to himself, that he had not thought about the empty rooms of this house once since she had arrived. And he was aware, further, that this awareness was information about himself that he was not certain he was ready for. I'll look into the note at the bank on Tuesday, he said. Doc finished his cup and stood. Look into who changed it while you're there. And after Doc left, Carter sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet. And Nora had finished with the ledger and put it back where she'd found it and was at the counter, working with the bread flour and the cast iron pan, and moving through his kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned to make use of what was available without asking whether she was welcome to. And he watched her do this and thought about how long it had been since someone had moved through this kitchen as though it were a place where living happened. The apron that had hung by the pantry door for 3 years was still on its hook. Nora was not wearing it. And She had her sleeves pushed up past her wrists and was working with her hands, and she had not touched the apron, and something about that told him more than if she had. And later, when the supper things were cleared, and he found her standing at the front window, and arms folded, and her profile lit from behind by the fire's glow. And he came and stood near her, not beside her, near. Silas Drum asked about you at the station, he said. By name. Before anyone told him you were here. She didn't look away from the window. Something changed in the set of her shoulders. Not a flinch, a settling. And like a door closing quietly inside her, and it wasn't the first time that door had closed. And he knew my employer in Denver. They had a business arrangement. She paused. I didn't know that until just now when you said that. Carter waited. My employer asked for things outside of my position. I refused. I was dismissed that same week. Her voice was factual, not cold. And factual in the way of someone reporting events they have already fully processed and no longer need to perform feeling about. The events are over. The feeling was spent somewhere private. And what remains is the account of what happened. That's how I came to have time to take a train to Harrow Valley in January. Carter looked at the dark yard, the snow-covered fence posts, the darkness where the barn sat just past visible range. And Drum wants the water rights on the western acreage. I know. He's been trying to acquire them for 2 years. I know that too. It's in the older ledger pages. She finally looked at him, and straight and direct, the firelight catching the edge of her face. He's been doing it through whatever method presents itself. It appears I was one of the methods. He held her gaze. And outside the window, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the fence line, stirring the shadows in the snow. He wanted to say that she didn't have to be involved in this, that the problem was his and he'd handle it. He didn't say it because it wasn't true. And she was already involved. She had been involved before she'd bought the train ticket, before she'd walked 4 miles in the dark and cold and let herself into his barn. And she had been moved into position by a man who treated people as instruments, and she had not known it and could not have. The only question now was what position she would occupy going forward. You can leave, he said. I'll pay your fare back to Denver. And she looked at him for a moment. And then she looked back out the window. Her voice when it came was quiet, but it had a shape to it, something cut from certainty rather than impulse. I haven't done anything wrong. I don't intend to run from it as though I have. Carter said nothing. The fire shifted. And the wind moved through the cottonwoods again. Inside the house, the silence had a quality he hadn't been able to identify in 3 years of nights here alone. It had occupied space before, and the way water occupies a vessel. Now it was different, still quiet, but the quiet that exists between two presences rather than inside one absence. He poured water for both of them and turned down the lamp on the desk and went up the stairs. At the top, he paused without turning. And he had something to say, and he said it to the dark hallway rather than to her face, because he was not practiced at this and needed to start somewhere manageable. And the note's been changed. The date's wrong. I don't know how yet, but someone did it deliberately. A pause. You found it in an afternoon. I should have found it months ago. Below him, she didn't respond immediately. And when she did, and it was just 3 words. And there was nothing in them that tried to make him feel better about it. And you will now. And he went to bed, and for the first time in 3 winters in this house, he lay in the dark and thought about tomorrow instead of yesterday. And the Tuesday road into Harrow was broken by the timber wagon at first light, the way it always was. The wheel ruts cut through 18 inches of packed snow and refreezing overnight into something that tested a horse's ankles and a driver's patience in equal measure. And Carter took the buckboard rather than riding, because he intended to bring the ledger and intended to stay long enough in town that the cold would matter over distance. He did not ask Nora whether she was coming. And he simply harnessed the roan and brought the buckboard around to the front of the house, and she was already on the porch in her wool coat with the ledger tucked under her arm, and her breath making small clouds in the morning air. They didn't speak much on the road in. And the cold required a kind of concentration that discouraged conversation, the roan picking its way through the ruts with the deliberate care of an animal that had learned to read ice. And Carter kept his weight back, and the reins easy. Nora sat straight on the board seat beside him, her hands in her lap, watching the country they passed through. The San Juan foothills rose to the west in the pale morning light. The lower pastures along the road showed patches of gray-brown grass where the wind had the snow thin. Carter's land ran along this stretch for nearly a mile, and he was aware of it the way you're aware of your own heartbeat. Not consciously, but immediately when something changes. Harrow was not a large town. It had a quality common to high-country Colorado settlements of that era, a collection of timber and stone buildings arranged along a single main street as though they'd arrived one at a time and each had claimed the nearest available space without consulting the others. The mercantile anchored one end, the livery the other, and between them sat the bank, the land office, two saloons, Ruth Penny's rooming house and its attached dining room, the telegraph office, Doc Briggs's surgery above the hardware store, and the small stone chapel where Reverend Cole preached on Sundays to whoever the weather permitted to attend. The whole of it could be walked end to end in 4 minutes. Carter tied the roan at the post in front of the bank and went inside with the ledger. The bank manager was a man named Aldous Peck, thin and precise in the way of someone who had decided early that precision was the only quality he could reliably produce and had organized his entire life around demonstrating it. He managed the accounts of nearly every working property in Custer County, which meant he had, by Carter's private estimation, more information about the financial condition of Harrow Valley than any man ought to have about his neighbors. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned that information held carefully was its own form of currency, and he spent it accordingly. Carter laid the ledger open on Peck's desk to the October column and pointed to the date beside the note entry. He said nothing. He let the number do the talking. Peck looked at it. His expression did something complicated that he brought under control quickly. The kind of facial management that happens when someone sees a thing they have been hoping would not be seen. He opened his own ledger from the drawer and found the corresponding page and looked at it. Then he looked at Carter's ledger. Then at his own again. There appears to be a discrepancy, Peck said. Carter's hands were flat on the desk. When I was here in November, you told me the note came due in March. I may have been working from an earlier version of the terms. Who revised the terms? Peck's eyes moved, a small involuntary movement, toward the window, toward nothing in particular, or toward nothing he intended to acknowledge. These things can sometimes be amended in the course of normal administration. Carter reached across the desk and closed Peck's ledger. Not hard, deliberately. He looked at the man and let the silence sit between them for long enough to become uncomfortable, which with a man like Peck did not take long. I'd like to see the original note document. Peck's hand went to the drawer and came back without opening it. I'd need time to locate the relevant file. I'll wait. Peck located the file in 4 minutes, which told Carter it had not required locating. It had required Peck deciding what to do with it and deciding he had no reasonable alternative to producing it. He put the file on the desk. Carter opened it and read the original terms of the note, which specified the 30th of March as the due date. Then he turned to the amendment page. The paper was a slightly different weight than the original. The date had been altered in handwriting that was not Carter's and was not, he was now fairly certain, Peck's either. The amendment bore 2 signatures. One was Peck's. The other was a signature Carter had seen at the bottom of a document produced from the breast pocket of a tweed vest 3 weeks prior. He closed the file. He took a breath, the way he took difficult physical things, squarely and with full acknowledgement of the weight involved. This amendment doesn't bear my signature. Peck said nothing. A note can't be amended without both parties. Peck said, Mr. Hale, I think it would be in everyone's interest to handle this matter through appropriate channels, rather than, I'll be speaking to the county land office this afternoon, Carter said. He picked up his own ledger from the desk and to the circuit judge when he comes through in February. He stood, and the standing itself was something. The full height of him coming to bear in that small office. The way the space reorganized itself around him, the way spaces always did. If the original terms are not restored in writing and delivered to my property by Friday, I'll put every document in this file in front of that judge myself. He left Peck's office and went back out to the cold Main Street where Nora was waiting beside the buckboard. She read his face when he came out with the accuracy of someone accustomed to reading situations from the outside. Drum's signature is on the amendment, he told her. She absorbed this without visible reaction. Peck cooperated with it. Peck cooperated with it. She looked down the street toward nothing, thinking. Then, the land office. Is the deed in your name exclusively? He hadn't considered that Drum might have moved on that front as well. He considered it now. Yes, it should be. Check it today, she said, before you do anything else that announces your position. He looked at her. She was already turning toward the land office down the block, coat collar up, boots sure on the packed snow of the boardwalk. He followed. The deed was intact. Carter stood in front of the clerk's index and read every entry under his name twice, and Nora stood beside him and read them too, and when they were satisfied, they left. On the boardwalk outside, Carter felt something release in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched. The land was still entirely his. Drum had moved on the financing, but not yet on the title. There was still room to move. Ruth Penny's dining room was the only place in Harrow that served a midday meal, and Carter needed coffee and needed to sit somewhere that wasn't a government office. He went in without thinking about whether Nora would follow, and she followed. Ruth Penny was behind the counter in her working clothes, the heavy canvas apron over the dark dress she wore every day, her gray hair in the tight bun she'd maintained for 30 years. She was a woman who had built her business entirely on the strength of her own judgment about people, which meant she had developed a quality of assessment that was not always comfortable to be on the receiving end of. She looked at Carter. She looked at Nora. She looked at Nora for longer than was strictly necessary, the look of a woman cataloging details for future reference, running the figure of this person against everything she'd already heard, and forming a provisional verdict. Then she put 2 cups on the counter and poured coffee into both of them and said nothing, which was either acceptance or reservation of judgment. And Carter had known her long enough to know it was probably both simultaneously. They sat at the table by the window. Carter wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at the street. 3 men in canvas work coats coming out of the hardware store. The livery boy leading a horse with a loose shoe. The ordinary motion of an ordinary Tuesday in a town that had not yet been asked to take sides in anything. He was aware that it would be asked soon. Ruth Penny brought said and set it between them and remained standing at the table rather than going back to the counter, which was her way of indicating she had something to say and intended to say it at her own pace. Silas Drum was in here yesterday, she said, addressing this to the bread rather than to either of them. Had lunch with 2 men from Pueblo. One of them had a land assessor's bag. Carter set his cup down. They were looking at the creek maps, Ruth continued. The county survey maps that Aldous Peck let them use. They were in here 2 hours. She picked up an invisible crumb from the table and disposed of it. I'm not telling you anything you need to do something with right now. I'm telling you what I saw. Went back to the counter. Carter looked at Nora. Nora was looking at the street. He's moving faster, she said. The assessors mean he's already planning what he'll do with the water rights. He's not waiting to see if you'll sell. He's building the plan for after he takes it. The way she said this, without drama, the way you state a geological fact about the landscape you're standing on. He had known ranchers who talked around a problem for an hour before naming it. She named it in 1 sentence and moved on. He ate the bread and drank the coffee and thought about what came next. He had enough in the livestock account to cover the note at the original March date, but not at the amended one, not without selling cattle in January at winter prices, which would be selling them at the worst possible value. Drum would know this. Anyone with access to the county records and a working knowledge of ranch economics would know this. The question was not whether Drum had a plan. The question was how many moves ahead the plan already was. They were nearly done with the coffee when the door opened, and the cold came in with Malcolm Shaw. Carter did not know him by name or face. He registered a man of middling height and city clothes, a wool overcoat cut for Denver or Pueblo rather than ranch country, wearing it in the self-conscious way of someone aware it marked them as outside. The man looked around the dining room and found Nora, and his expression went through several things in quick succession, one of which was unmistakably relief. Another was something less clean than relief. Nora went very still. The stillness lasted only a second. And then she sat back in her chair with the deliberateness that put distance between her spine and the chair back, the posture of someone preparing to hold their own ground from a standing start. She did not look surprised, and she looked like someone who had known a particular bill would come due eventually and had simply not known the exact date. Shaw came to the table and stood at the end of it, hat in his hands, working the brim with his fingers. Nora, I heard you'd come out here, and I wanted to make sure you were all right. Her voice when she answered was entirely level. Malcolm, how did you hear? He shifted his weight. Word travels. And word travels from where to where, specifically. He looked at Carter, then back at her. You don't know this man. You don't know anything about this place. I only wanted to offer you. Malcolm. Just his name. It stopped him. You don't make offers. You deliver them. And tell me who sent you. The silence that followed was the silence of a man who had been handed a script and was discovering mid-performance that his audience had seen the script before. And he tried once more, his voice dropping to something he apparently intended as private. Come back to Denver. You don't owe these people anything. Nora pushed back her chair and stood. Not quickly, and with the unhurried deliberateness of someone making a choice rather than reacting to one. She looked at Shaw straight, and what was in her face was not anger. It was a clarity so complete, it was almost impersonal. And the look of someone who has taken the full measure of a situation and found it exactly as small as they expected. And I came here of my own will. I am here of my own will, and I don't owe you an explanation for either. Shaw put his hand out toward her arm. Carter stood up. He did not move toward Shaw. He did not say anything. And he simply stood. And the act of standing in that low-ceilinged room, and the full height of him, and the breadth of him in the canvas coat, and the absolute unhurried quality of it, and was something that required no supplementing. And Shaw's hand stopped where it was, not quite reaching Nora's arm, and then withdrew. Shaw looked at Carter for a moment. He was calculating odds with considerable speed and finding the calculation straightforward. He put his hat on and went back out into the cold. And Nora picked up her coat from the back of the chair and put it on, buttoning it from the bottom up the way she always did. Carter left money on the table, and they went outside. And at the buckboard, Nora stood for a moment with her hand on the side rail, looking down the street in the direction Shaw had gone. He was sent by Drum, she said. Most likely. Carter untied the roan. Do you know the connection? My employer in Denver, Owen Hargrove. And he and Drum have a supplying arrangement. I didn't know that when I worked for Hargrove. I only knew Hargrove. She turned and looked at Carter. Drum knew about me before I came here because Hargrove told him. And the bureau that gave me your letter is in Denver. He must have known the bureau would place someone's, and he arranged to know who. Carter thought about this on the road back, the timeline of it. Drum knowing Nora's name at the stations before anyone had told him. And the amendment to the note with Drum's signature beside the banker's. The assessors with their county survey maps, each piece of this had been placed before Nora had stepped onto the train. And she had been an instrument in a plan she hadn't known existed, and Drum had expected her presence at the ranch to create some advantage he could leverage. Carter could not yet see the exact shape of the leverage, but he could see the shape of a man who didn't move without a full hand. The snow had thickened by the time they reached the ranch. Carter unhitched the roan and put him up, and Nora went inside and had the stove going by the time he came in from the barn. And he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, wet with snow across the shoulders of his coat, watching her work. She had found the dried herbs on the shelf and was using them in something on the stove, and the kitchen had a smell it hadn't had in 3 years. And the smell of a meal being made by someone who was making it rather than just producing it. He thought about what Doc Briggs had said, what position she would occupy next. And he thought about Nora standing up from that table with the unhurried certainty of someone who knew precisely what she was doing and why. And he thought, whatever position she occupies, she has earned it herself. That evening, after supper, he told her about Hannah. And he had not planned to. He was not a man who planned to tell people things. He either said them or he didn't, and the conditions that produced one or the other were not something he had ever been able to predict or control. And what produced it that night was this. And she asked him, and directly, not with prying curiosity, but with the focused practicality of someone who needed to understand the shape of a situation she was now inside, whether the ranch had ever been jointly held, whether Hannah had had any legal claim to the title that might have created complications in the deed. He said no, the deed had always been his alone. Hannah had come to the marriage with her mother's rocking chair and a cedar chest of quilts, and the mare, and the ranch had been his before her and was his after. Then he said, because the subject had been opened, and leaving it half open was worse. She wanted children. We had 4 years. The last time, she got partway through the winter and then didn't. He looked at the fire. The doctor in Pueblo was a day's ride in good weather. In April, with the roads washed out, he was 2 days. He got here in time to tell me what I already knew. Nora was quiet for long enough that he was certain she would say nothing. Then she said something he was not prepared for. You've been blaming yourself for the road. He looked at her. For not having a shorter road, or a faster horse, or a different piece of land. She was looking at the fire, too. You chose the land, and the land had that road, and when the road mattered most, it was too long. And so you've been deciding that the land was the wrong choice, and the wrong choice was yours. Carter said nothing. That's not blame, she said. That's just grief looking for a place to live. He sat with that for a while. The fire settled in the hearth, a log dropping to coals. Outside the window, the snow was still falling. He said, what does yours look like? She considered this as a genuine question, which it was. Mine looks like work, she said. Mine looks like making myself too useful to discard, and then being discarded anyway, and then getting up the next morning and starting over. She paused. I got very good at starting over. The problem is that you can get so good at it that you stop believing the starting has a point. He looked at her then, and she was looking at the fire, and in the firelight her profile was clear and steady. The face of someone who had said a true thing and was neither proud of it nor ashamed. The thing he said next surprised him as much as it surprised her. You have a point here, if you want one. She turned and looked at him. He held her gaze. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean, partly by nature, and partly because he had learned that imprecise communication, in practical matters, cost time and money, and sometimes animals. He had extended that discipline into every other area of his life, without thinking much about it. He meant what he had said. He did not dress it up or explain it further, because it didn't require either. After a moment, she looked back at the fire. Her hands were folded in her lap. I know, she said quietly. I think I knew before you said it. 2 mornings later, the community meeting notice arrived. Ruth Penny sent it out by her nephew, who rode the circuit of notices every time there was a matter of county business requiring a public airing. This one announced a meeting at the Harrow Meeting Hall on Friday evening, called at the request of Silas Drum and 3 other property holders in the valley, to discuss water access and the proposed Eastern Road expansion. Carter read the notice twice and handed it to Nora without comment. She read it and set it on the sk. The road expansion is a pretext. He's building the public record for the water rights claim. Carter went to the barn and split wood for an hour. On Friday, they drove into Harrow in the early dark. The meeting hall was the largest interior space in Harrow outside the livery. A timber room that could hold 60 people and that held. When Carter pushed through the door, perhaps 40. He knew most of them. Ranchers from the surrounding valley, their wives in wool coats and bonnets, the men in their working canvas and flannel, the hardware store owner, 2 of the 3 barkeeps, Reverend Cole at the end of a pew with his hands folded, watching the room with the patience of a man who had sat through many long evenings of other people's disputes and had made his peace with the duration. Doc Briggs against the back wall with his arms crossed, watching the room the way he watched patients, looking for things that didn't present with their true symptoms. Silas Drum stood at the front in his tweed vest and silk waistcoat, his hair combed flat, looking like a man who had already decided how the evening would end. Beside him sat the 2 men from Pueblo, the assessors, with a county survey map spread on the front table. Carter moved to a seat on the left side of the room. Nora sat beside him. He was aware of the attention this created. The particular quality of attention that a room of people who know each other gives to someone new, especially a woman, who has arrived under circumstances that Ruth Penny had had nearly a week to describe to her various dining room audiences. He did not acknowledge the attention, and Nora did not either. She sat with her hands folded over her coat in her lap and looked at the front of the room and waited. Drum opened the meeting with the road expansion, which occupied 15 minutes and resolved nothing, and then moved to the matter he'd actually come to address. He laid it out with the practiced fluency of a man who had rehearsed this presentation. The water rights in the Bristle Creek corridor. The need for consolidated management of a shared valley resource. The difficulty of maintaining equitable access when one property held a disproportionate share of the upstream flow. He spoke about Carter's ranch by acreage and water share, without using Carter's name, which was a performance of objectivity so thin that Doc Briggs, at the back wall, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then Drum said it. Not the note, not the amendment. Those were cards he'd play privately. What he said, publicly, in a room of 40 people, was this. There's also the matter of how a property is managed when circumstances change. A man ranching alone, without family, without a partner, faces challenges of continuity that the valley as a whole has an interest in, particularly when that property controls the water that sustains everyone here. The room went quiet in a particular way. Carter stood up. He didn't push to the front. He stood where he was, in the middle of the left side of the room, and the standing itself changed the geometry of the space. People shifted, not away from him, toward him, the way people orient to something that has declared its position clearly and without decoration. His voice was even and not raised. The Hale Ranch has been a working property for 22 years. The water rights on Bristle Creek have been legally held and properly maintained for the same period. The note on the western acreage will be paid at its original terms, which are the terms I agreed to, and which will be restored in writing before the end of this week. He paused. If there's a concern about water access in this valley, I'll hear it from my neighbors directly, not from a document someone else put my signature on. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the full silence of a room of people recalibrating. Doc Briggs stood up from the back wall. Carter Hale has run good water stewardship on that creek for 2 decades. Every rancher in this room has benefited from the way that land is managed. I'll put my name to that. Reverend Cole, without standing, said clearly enough for the room. So will I. Ruth Penny was 3 rows back, and she said, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone. Man's been here longer than half the buildings on Main Street. Drum had not lost his composure. He was too practiced for that. But something had shifted in the room's orientation, the way a weather vane shifts. Not dramatically, just to the true direction. He made a short, careful remark about the value of open dialogue, and the meeting was adjourned. In the cold outside the hall, people moved past them toward their horses and wagons. Several stopped and shook Carter's hand. Not many, 3 or 4. But the quality of the handshakes was different from the ordinary social variety. These were the handshakes of people who had made a decision. Nora stood beside him through all of it, not speaking, not performing anything, simply present. When the last of the hands had been shaken and the street was thinning out, Doc Briggs came and stood with them. He'll come at the property directly now, Doc said. He built a record tonight. Next, he'll move on it. Carter nodded. He had expected this. I have the original note document, Doc continued. Made a copy of it before I sent the original back with you. Peck doesn't know that. He said it without pride, just the clean delivery of information. Whatever Drum does next, you have the original terms on paper. Carter looked at him. He had known this man for 10 years and was still periodically surprised by him. When did you make that copy? The same day I sent your letter to Denver. The pause that followed this was significant. Doc had the look of a man who had been waiting for this particular moment and was now discovering it was both as necessary and as uncomfortable as he'd anticipated. I owe you a conversation about that, he said. Sooner than later. Carter looked at him steadily. Saturday. Come to the ranch. Doc nodded and walked to his horse. In the buckboard on the way home, neither of them spoke for the first mile. The snow had stopped, and the road was clear and cold under a sky that had finally broken open to show stars. The high country stars that appeared after a clearing in January, with a brightness that felt almost aggressive after days of gray. The roan moved steadily in the cold, his breath coming in rhythmic clouds. Nora said, "He'll use me next. Whatever Drum does, he'll make me part of it. My presence here, the circumstances, he'll use it to create a version of events that damages your standing." Carter kept his eyes on the road. Let him try. She looked at him. He could feel it without looking. He had said something in Ruth Penny's dining room during the confrontation with Shaw. He had said it in front of Ruth, and whoever else had been in the room at that hour, and word had traveled from there with the speed that words travel in a town the size of Harrow. He had called Nora his wife. He had not been asked to, had not planned to, had not made any decision he was consciously aware of. The word had come because it was the right word for what he intended to convey, and because, somewhere in the days between her arrival and that moment, he had arrived at a position he had not mapped out and could not fully explain, but could not honestly deny. Nora had heard about it from Ruth Penny the next morning. She had said nothing to him about it. He had said nothing to her. The words sat between them in the buckboard, on the cold road home, not spoken but present, the way certain true things occupy a space before they're named. The lights of the ranch appeared through the tree line. The roan picked up his pace, smelling the barn. Carter said, "I didn't plan what I said in that room." Nora was quiet. "But I meant it," he said. "Not as a strategy. As a direction, if you're willing." She looked at her hands in her lap for a while. The buckboard turned through the gate, and the frozen gravel of the yard crunched under the wheels. When she answered, it was with the considered honesty of someone who had decided that anything less was no longer something she had the patience for. "I've been useful to people my whole life, and I know how to be useful. What I don't know how to do is believe that I'm wanted for something other than my usefulness." He pulled the roan up at the barn and sat for a moment before getting down. "Then I'll be patient," he said, "while you learn it." He climbed down and went to unhitch the roan, and she sat in the buckboard for a moment in the cold. And then she climbed down too and went inside. And the yard was quiet, and the stars above the San Juan ridgeline were very bright and very old. And somewhere in that stillness, something had been said that neither of them was ready to fully hold yet, but that both of them would carry into the next morning and every morning after that. Doc Briggs came on Saturday, the way he said he would, mid-morning, when the light was still low and flat across the snow, and the cold had settled in with the particular quality of something that had made its decision about staying. He came alone and on horseback rather than in the buggy, which meant he had not intended this to be a long visit, but had known it would require the faster arrival and departure that a horse afforded when a conversation went sideways. Carter read all of this in the first 30 seconds of watching him come through the gate and said nothing about it. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Nora sat with them. Because Carter had not asked her to leave, and she had not offered to, and because what Doc had to say concerned her as directly as it concerned, Carter and all three of them understood this without discussing it. And Doc wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the table for a moment. The look of a man organizing a confession he has rehearsed and is discovering the rehearsal didn't quite cover the reality of the room. "I've known you 11 years, Carter. And in that time, you have not done one thing I'd call a mistake in judgment. You've been wrong about weather, and you've been wrong about cattle prices, and once you were wrong about a fence post that took down a whole corner section this spring. But those are practical errors. And your judgment about what matters has been sound." Carter waited. "You wrote that letter," Doc said. "I found it in your desk the night I came to check on you after the second winter. You'd left the drawer open. I wasn't going looking for it." He paused. "But I read it. And I kept thinking about it. And 6 months later, I sent it to the bureau in Denver because you were disappearing, and I didn't know another way to stop it." The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the roan Doc had tied to the porch. Post shifted his weight, and the leather creaked. Carter looked at his cup. He looked at it for a long time. The anger was there, and he could feel the shape of it, and the specific shape of having something private taken and used without permission, and even with good intentions. even with results that were sitting 3 feet away from him in a wool coat with her hands folded on the table. The anger was real, and he did not dismiss it. But underneath the anger was something else. The letter existed because he had needed it to exist. He had put the words into the world, even if only into a drawer, because the need to say them had been greater than the fear of what saying them meant. Doc had simply moved those words from one private space to a larger one. The intention behind the letter and the intention behind sending it were, when he sat honestly with both, the same intention expressed by two different men at two different levels of courage. "You had no right to go into my desk," he said. "No," Doc said. "I didn't. And no right to send something I hadn't decided to send." "No, I didn't have that right either." Carter turned his cup on the table, a slow half-rotation. "But you'd do it again." Doc looked at him steadily. "I'd do it again." The honesty of this, undecorated and unqualified, was the thing that moved Carter past the anger rather than through it. He had no use for apologies that were really requests for absolution. What Doc had offered was something rarer and more useful. The plain acknowledgement of a choice made, owned completely, without revision. Carter looked at Nora. She had been watching him through all of this, with the attention of someone tracking a weather system, reading it without trying to direct it. Now she met his eyes and said, the letter was true. Whatever he did with it, the letter was true. He held her gaze. She was right. He had written that letter from the most honest place he'd operated from in 2 years. The facts of its journey, from his drawer to her hands, did not change what it had said or what he had meant by saying it. He looked back at Doc. "You're going to tell me the rest of it. All of it. The note, what you know about Drum, what you've been doing with the copies you made." Doc told him. It took 40 minutes and 2 more cups of coffee and covered more ground than Carter had anticipated. Because Doc had been watching Silas Drum operate in Harrow Valley for 3 years and had been making careful note of it, the way that careful men make note of patterns they don't yet understand but recognize as significant. He had a ledger of his own, not financial, a kind of running account of observable facts. Dates when Drum's men had been seen on the creek road, conversations overheard at Ruth Penny's, the names of 2 other Valley property holders who had accepted Drum's offers under circumstances that didn't quite add up to simple willing sales. He had the copy of Carter's original note terms folded in his coat pocket, which he produced and laid on the table. When Doc had finished, Carter sat with the full weight of the situation arranged in front of him, where he could see it clearly for the first time. Drum had not been improvising. He had been executing a plan that had begun, before Carter knew there was one, that had used Nora as one instrument among several, that had moved simultaneously on the banking records, the community standing, and the physical survey of the water rights. The plan was sophisticated and it was largely in place. What Drum had not accounted for was that his instrument had turned. Carter looked at Nora, the assessors who were in Harrow with their maps. "You understand land survey documents well enough." Well enough to read what they were building a claim around. "Yes." He looked at Doc. Can you get those survey maps? The county survey records are public. Anyone can request them from the land office." "Request them on Monday," Carter said. "Don't go yourself. Send someone. Drum won't connect to you." Doc nodded once. He finished his coffee and stood and put on his coat. At the door, he paused and looked at Carter with the directness of a man who has already said the hard thing and found it survivable. "For what it's worth, she showed up because she made a choice. Whatever I did with the letter, she made the choice." He went out. The door closed, and his horse's hooves crunched across the yard and faded toward the gate. Carter sat at the table for a moment longer. Then he said, to the middle distance rather than directly at her, "I'm going to ask you something tonight. I want you to know it's coming so it doesn't catch you wrong." Nora said nothing, but she had gone very still in the way she went still when something mattered. He pushed back from the table and went to the barn. He spent the afternoon sorting tack and checking the rope stock and going through the grain supply with the methodical attention that winter management required. Belle stood in her stall and watched him the way she always did, with the side-eye patience of an old horse that has made its accommodation with the shape of its days. He worked and he thought, and the working and thinking occupied the same channel the way they always had for him, each making room for the other rather than competing. And by late afternoon, he had resolved three things. The first was that he was going to ride into Harrow that evening before supper and see Reverend Cole and ask a specific question. And the second was that he was going to the silversmith on the same errand because the silversmith kept his shop open late on Saturdays, and Carter had a purpose that required the silversmith's inventory rather than anything in his own house. And the third thing he had resolved was that he was done disappearing into the past. And the resolution had not come from deciding to be done with it. Grief didn't work that way. You didn't decide to finish with it. And you found, and eventually, and something in the present that required your full presence in return. And you turned toward it. And the past remained the past. Which was the only place it had ever actually lived. And he saddled the roan in the late afternoon light and rode the 4 miles into Harrow alone, fast, the cold a flat force against his face that he addressed by leaning into it. And he tied up at the chapel first. And Reverend Cole answered the door in his shirt sleeves, and a book in his hand, and stood back to let Carter in without asking why. Because in 19 years of ministry, he had learned to recognize the arrival that meant someone had come with a real question rather than a social one. Carter asked his question. Cole answered it. They stood in the cold entryway for 6 minutes, and when Carter left, he had what he'd come for, which was not permission exactly, but the knowledge that what he intended was possible on the terms he intended it. He went to the silversmith next. Horace Webb had been making and repairing silver work in Harrow for 15 years. A small, compact man with hands that looked wrong for the delicacy of his work, until you watched him work and then looked exactly right. Carter told him what he needed. Webb opened his display case and laid 3 options on the velvet-lined tray. Carter looked at them with the seriousness he gave to significant practical decisions and chose the simplest one. A plain band with a single engraved line around the circumference. No ornament, nothing that would catch on work or require special attention. Something built to last the duration of a life spent using your hands. And he paid for it and put it in his vest pocket and rode home in the full dark. Nora had supper on when he came in. And he could smell it from the porch, the good smell of something that had been cooking for hours. And the kitchen was warm and lit. And she was at the stove with her back to the door, in her dark wool dress with her sleeves pushed up past her wrists. And he came in and hung up his coat and the vest with the ring in the pocket over it and sat down at the table. And she served the meal and sat across from him, and they ate in the ordinary way they had developed over the weeks she'd been here, the easy silence of people who had stopped needing to fill each other's company with sound. And when the plates were cleared and the coffee poured, he looked at her across the table in the lamplight. And I told you this morning I had something to ask. She set her cup down. He did not reach for the vest or produce anything. And he kept his hands on the table, and he spoke plainly, because plainness was the only register he had fully trusted since Hannah, and it was the only one he intended to use for anything that mattered. I'm not asking because the ranch needs someone. I'm not asking because of Drum, or the note, or anything that has to do with the condition of this property. I'm asking because something that had stopped in me has started again, and the only honest account I have for why is you. Nora was very still. I know you came here under circumstances that were not fully what they appeared to be, he continued. And I know you've had things promised to you that weren't kept. I know you've learned to build everything yourself, because waiting for someone else to build it meant it didn't get built. He looked at her steadily across the table. And I'm not asking you to stop building. I'm asking if you'll build something with me instead of beside me. The fire in the hearth moved. The lamp on the desk threw its steady circle of light. And outside the Colorado dark was absolute. The kind that comes on clear nights in January when the clouds have lifted and there is nothing between the land and the sky but cold and distance. Nora looked at him for a long moment. And when she spoke with the care of someone who has learned that words used imprecisely are their own kind of damage. And if I say yes, I need you to know what you're getting. I'm not easy to know. I go quiet when I should speak, and I speak when most people would be quiet. I have strong opinions about accounts that I will not keep to myself. I have been told I am too plain and too practical and not warm enough, and I have decided that whoever told me those things was describing their own preferences, not my deficiencies. Carter said, I know. You've known me 5 weeks. And I know what 5 weeks of watching a person carefully will tell you. And I've been watching carefully. She looked at him, steadily across the table. Something in her face was doing a thing he hadn't seen before. Not a softening. She was not a woman who softened, but a yielding of some long-held structure, the way ice yields at the edges in the first days of a thaw. Before the main body has committed to anything, she said. Cole is in the chapel, he said. He's expecting us. She looked at him for one more moment, and then she pushed back from the table and went upstairs. He waited. He could hear her moving above him, the boards, the quiet, deliberate sounds of a woman, preparing herself for something she had decided to do. He got his coat from the peg and held hers. And when she came down, she was wearing the blue wool dress she'd had in the traveling bag, and the one good thing she'd brought, and her hair was pinned up properly, and she looked at him in the lamplight, and he thought that there was no version of dressed or undressed that would change the fundamental fact of her face, which was that it was the face of someone who had become, through nothing but the sustained pressure of her own character, exactly who she was. He held her coat. She put it on. He went to the barn before they left and saddled Belle. He brought her out into the yard already bridled. Nora came from the house and saw the old mare standing there, breath clouding in the cold night air, and she went to her without hesitation and ran one hand along the line of the mare's jaw before she mounted. Belle stood perfectly still for it. Carter saw this from where he was adjusting the roan's cinch and said nothing and filed it the way he filed things, carefully and permanently. They rode into Harrow in the dark on separate horses, the roan and Belle side by side on the empty road, their breath rising in matched clouds. Harrow was quiet at this hour. The saloons going, but the rest of the town shut down. Lamplight, in a few windows, the telegraph office dark. Cole's chapel showed a light in the side room where he worked in the evenings. Doc Briggs was at the chapel door when they arrived. He had not been told to come. He had come anyway, because 11 years of friendship and the particular quality of Carter's conversation with him that morning had been sufficient information for a man of his perceptiveness. He stood in his coat with his hat in his hands, and he looked at them both, and something in his face settled. The look of a man who has spent considerable worry on a problem and is watching the problem resolve itself beyond what he dared expect. Ruth Penny was inside in the back pew. Carter looked at her when they entered. She looked back at him with the complete lack of apology of a woman who has she has as much right to be present at the important moments of her town's life as anyone else, and that this right requires no justification. Word travels, she said, which answered the question he hadn't asked. Cole was ready. He wore the black coat and the white collar, and he stood at the front of the small chapel in the lamplight with the particular steadiness of a man doing what he was made to do. He waited while Carter and Nora came down the short aisle and stood before him. He asked the questions he had discussed with Carter that afternoon, pared down to what was essential, the true architecture of a vow rather than its decoration. Do you come here by your own will? Carter said yes. Nora said yes. Do you promise to walk beside each other in this? Not ahead? Not behind, beside. Carter said yes. Nora said yes. Do you give not what is perfect, but what is real? Carter said yes. Nora said yes. Carter took the ring from his vest pocket and put it on her hand. Her hands were warm. They did not shake. He looked at her face while he did it, and she was looking at his hands. And when the ring was in place, she looked up and met his eyes, and what was there was not the theatrical radiance of someone performing happiness, but the quieter and more durable light of someone who has found, after considerable searching in difficult country, the thing they did not let themselves believe they were still looking for. Cole pronounced them, and Doc Briggs said something under his breath at the back of the chapel that might have been approval or might have been relief, and was probably both. Ruth Penny did not cry. She was not a woman who cried at things. She pressed her lips together in the way she did when something met her standard, and that was its own form of benediction. Carter reached into the coat he wore and brought out the folded wool of Hannah's shawl, which he had kept in the cedar chest for 3 years. And he held it toward Nora without speaking. She looked at it and then at him, and she understood. The way she had understood the room, at the top of the stairs, with the quilt on the bed. That this was something that had belonged to someone else, and that its being offered now was not a replacement, but a passage. A thing made sacred by what it had meant, and being made sacred again by what it now meant. She took it and draped it over her shoulders, with both hands, carefully, the way you handle something that has earned its weight. They rode home under the January stars, the roan and Belle side by side on the empty road. And Carter did not speak, and Nora did not speak, and the silence between them had reached the state that silence reaches between people who have made a large decision together and are still inside the first moments of having made it. Still feeling the weight and shape of it. Not ready to reduce it to words. 4 days later, Silas Drum came to the ranch. He came with his lawyer, a man named Getis from Pueblo, with a leather document case, and the practiced neutral expression of a man paid to stand beside other men while they made demands. They came in the afternoon, on a day when the clouds had come back, low and gray, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and they came to the front door rather than the back, which was a statement about how they intended to conduct this visit. Carter opened the door. He stood in the frame and did not move back to let them in, which meant they conducted their business on the porch with the cold coming down and their breath making clouds and the discomfort of the outdoor temperature distributed equally among them, which was the distribution Carter preferred. Drum produced the amended note agreement and the document his lawyer had drawn up. A purchase agreement for the western 300 acres at the inflated winter value he'd been offering since October. He laid them both on the porch rail, the way he laid documents everywhere, with the composed confidence of a man accustomed to having his papers received. He said the note came due in 11 days, and he was prepared to apply the purchase price against the note balance as a courtesy, which would leave Carter with a cash settlement and the eastern acreage intact. Carter looked at the documents on the rail without touching them. Nora came to the door. She stood beside Carter, not behind him, and she had the Harrow County survey map in one hand and the copy of the original note terms in the other. She had spent the 3 days since the county maps arrived at the ranch doing what she did when she had a set of numbers and a discrepancy and the willingness to follow both to their conclusion. She had found 3 things that Carter could not have found without her specific knowledge of accounts and land records, and she had written them down in the clear, precise hand she used for ledger work. And the document she had produced was currently folded in Carter's vest pocket. She said, "The amendment on the note carries Mr. Drum's signature, but not Mr. Hale's. A note amendment requires both parties. This document is therefore not legally binding." She held up the survey map, open to the creek corridor section. The parcel your assessors surveyed and the parcel described in this purchase agreement do not match in their boundary descriptions. The survey document uses the high water mark of the creek as the eastern boundary. The purchase agreement uses a fixed point that places the boundary 18 feet further west than the survey, which would give your parcel access to the primary channel rather than the seasonal overflow. This discrepancy is not a drafting error. Geddes looked at the documents in her hands. He looked at Drum. Drum had not moved. His face had the quality of a man revising his position without showing the revision in real time. The skilled blankness of someone who has been caught before and has learned to absorb the moment of being caught without reacting to it visibly. He said, "Mrs. Hale, I don't know what you think you've found, but legal interpretation of these documents requires." "I'm not interpreting," Nora said. "I'm reading. The numbers are the numbers." Carter took the folded document from his vest pocket and placed it on the rail beside Drum's papers. The original note terms, witnessed copy. If you proceed with any claim based on the amended document, this will be in front of the circuit judge in February, along with a statement from the county bank manager about the circumstances of the amendment. He looked at Drum steadily. "I'd expect Peck would prefer to discuss those circumstances privately before they become public record." Drum looked at the document. He looked at Carter. He looked at Nora. And it was the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch that his composure contained something other than calculation. What was there now, briefly and unmistakably, was the recognition of an adversary he had misidentified. He had put her on a train to Harrow, thinking she would be an instrument, and she had arrived and become something else entirely. And the plan he had built, around a particular understanding of who she was, had been built on false ground from the beginning. And Geddes said quietly to Drum, "We should discuss this before." Drum said nothing. He picked up his documents from the rail. He folded them with the same precise movements he used for everything, and put them in his coat. He picked up the purchase agreement. He did not pick up Carter's document, because it was Carter's document, and taking it would have acknowledged it existed, and he was not yet ready to make that acknowledgement. He looked at Carter. "You have a difficult piece of country here, Hale." Carter said, "I know it. Winter's long. Always has been." Drum put on his hat. He went down the porch steps with Geddes behind him, and they mounted their horses and rode back toward the gate. At the gate, Drum did not look back. That too was information. A man who looks back is a man still engaged. A man who doesn't has recalculated. Carter watched them until they were out of sight. Then he looked at Nora beside him on the porch. She was watching the gate. Her face was composed, the way it was always composed when she was working through something, rather than around it. Then she looked at him, and what was there was not triumph, not relief. It was something quieter than both of those things. The settled look of someone who has done what they came to do, and found that they were, in fact, equal to it. He put his hand over hers, where it rested on the porch rail. She didn't pull away. They stood there for a moment in the cold, looking at the empty gate and the snow-covered track leading out through the cottonwoods, and the ranch spread out behind them and on both sides of them, and the creek running somewhere beneath its ice in the west pasture, and all of it was still theirs. 3 weeks later, the circuit judge came through Harrow on his February circuit. Carter filed the claim regarding the note amendment. He filed it with the original terms document and the bank record copies Doc had secured, and a sworn statement from Aldous Peck, who had, in the intervening weeks, apparently made a calculation of his own about which direction the situation was moving, and had decided that cooperation with the legal proceeding was preferable to being on the wrong side of the judge's findings. The statement Peck provided was not generous to Drum, but it was accurate, and accuracy was what the proceeding required. The hearing was held in the meeting hall. Carter had not told anyone it would be a public proceeding, but Harrow was not a town where information of this kind remained private, and the people who filled the room had come because they had a stake in the outcome, whether they acknowledged it or not. The water rights on Bristle Creek fed every property on the eastern side of the valley. What happened to Carter's claim was not only Carter's business. Nora stood and presented the survey discrepancy. She had the maps, and she had the figures, and she had the calm of someone who has organized the truth neatly enough that it can stand on its own without being propped. She stood before a room of 40 Valley people in her dark wool dress, her hair pinned, the silver ring on her left hand, catching the light from the hall's windows. And she laid out what she had found the way she laid out everything, clearly, in order, without drama. The judge asked her 2 questions. She answered both with the same directness she brought to every factual matter. The judge looked at Drum's lawyer for a response. Geddes offered the interpretation that the boundary discrepancy was a drafting error. The judge looked at the 2 documents side by side for 45 seconds and said that drafting errors of 18 feet did not occur in assessors' surveys. They occurred in documents drawn after the surveys. And the direction of the error in this case was not consistent with an accident. The note amendment was voided. The original terms were reinstated. The water rights remained with the Hale Ranch at their existing boundaries. Drum sat at the front of the room through the ruling, with the same composed expression he brought to everything. Then he stood and buttoned his coat and left with Geddes, and the room watched him go. There was no celebration. These were ranch people. People who understood that a legal ruling was not the end of a thing, so much as the current position in an ongoing negotiation with a difficult country, and celebration was for completion, and completion was something most of them had learned not to expect. But something happened in the room when the ruling was read. A shifting. The reorientation of 40 people who had come not quite sure which way the valley would go and were now sure. Ruth Penny, seated in the second row, turned and looked at Nora. The look of assessment that she had given her in the dining room on that first Tuesday in town was still in the architecture of the look, but the assessment had resolved. What was there now had the structure of respect without needing the word. She said, loudly enough for the row behind her to hear. She's a Hale. It was 3 words. In a town the size of Harrow, 3 words said by Ruth Penny in a room of 40 people had the force of a public record. Carter heard it from where he stood at the side wall. He looked at Nora. She was looking at Ruth with an expression he had not seen on her before. Not quite disbelief and not quite relief. The expression of someone encountering a kindness they had not prepared for and are not certain what to do with because they have so rarely needed to know. She looked at Carter. He looked back at her. He did not smile because he was not a man who smiled easily in public and because the moment was too large for smiling. But she knew his face well enough by then to read the smaller signals. The fractional change in his expression that meant something she would not have known to look for 6 weeks ago. She looked back at the front of the room. They drove home in the buckboard in the late afternoon, the sky going gold over the western ridge. The kind of late winter light that comes once or twice in a Colorado February and reminds you that somewhere beyond the snow there is a different season being patient, holding itself ready to arrive. The road was easy going. The roan moved at a steady walk. Carter said Doc wants to come out Sunday. Nora said, I know. I already told him yes. He looked at her. She looked at the road ahead. He asked me yesterday when you were at the barn. I told him to come at noon and I'd have a proper meal. Carter returned to watching the road. He had been running the numbers on the spring cattle sale and the note payment and what remained after, and the numbers were not generous, but they were honest, and they included a margin that had not existed before Nora had found it in the ledger. He said, the eastern meadow will need refencing in April. I'll need another set of hands. I can hold a post, she said. I know you can. I can also keep the accounts while you do the fencing. If you'd rather not do both, he said. I'd rather not do both. She nodded. This was the shape of how they negotiated the practical things, in the direct shorthand of people who had learned quickly that the other person did not require managing, only information. He gave her information, and she made decisions from it, and he trusted the decisions because the weeks before the marriage and the weeks after had shown him, through the accumulated evidence of specific instances, that her judgment was sound. This was a different kind of trust than the trust he had built with Hannah, which had been the trust of 2 people growing into each other over years. This was faster and more deliberate and had a different grain to it. Not better or worse. Different in the way that 2 kinds of good timber are different, each right for its particular purpose. The ranch came into view through the tree line. The lamp he'd left burning in the kitchen window, throwing a square of yellow into the dusk. He pulled the roan into the yard, and they unhitched and put the horses up and went inside. And the kitchen was warm from the banked fire, and the house had the smell it had acquired in the weeks since her arrival. The smell of a place being lived in rather than occupied. That night the spring storm came. It came fast, the way the bad ones did in Colorado. The clouds moving in off the ridge in the hour after dark, and the temperature dropping hard, and the wind coming up, and the snow starting horizontal. By 9 o'clock, the yard was invisible beyond 15 feet, and the wind was taking the snow sideways against the window glass, with a sound like thrown gravel. Carter checked the barn shutters and came back in, and they moved to the sitting room because it was warmer than the kitchen at this hour, and he banked the fire high. Nora settled into the chair on the left side of the hearth, which had become her chair over the weeks without anyone saying so. Carter took the right. The lamp was low. The fire was high. Outside, the storm did what Colorado storms did when they came with purpose, which was to make the interior world completely interior, to draw a line around everything inside the walls and make it its own complete thing, separate from the dark and the wind and the cold that owned the rest of the world tonight. Carter said, to the fire rather than to her, I want to say something. Not as a practical matter. She looked at him. I spent 3 years in this house, afraid that if I opened a door, the cold would get all the way in, he said. I don't mean the cold outside. I mean the other kind. The kind that moves in when you've lost the main thing that kept you warm, and you're not sure you have enough left to make heat on your own. He turned and looked at her directly. You came in, and the cold didn't come with you. And I don't know how to account for that, except to say I don't think it was chance. I think you're the kind of person who keeps the cold out by the fact of who you are. And Nora looked at him with the face of someone who has just been accurately described, for the first time, by someone who has no reason to describe them inaccurately, and whose accuracy therefore carries a different weight than flattery ever could. And she said, after a moment, I've spent so long being practical about everything that I've sometimes thought I'd lost access to the rest of it. The part that isn't useful, the part that just needs a pause. And I hadn't lost it. I'd just been saving it for somewhere it would keep. The fire shifted. The storm pushed against the walls with a sound like something that wanted in and was not going to get in. The lamp threw its steady circle. And the two people in the circle sat with what had been said and let it settle the way good things settle, without being rushed toward the next thing. After a while, she said, I'm going to tell you something. And Doc already knows. He told me when he asked about Sunday. I wasn't ready to say it before the hearing. I wanted the hearing to be finished first. Carter waited. He thinks there'll be a child, she said. By late summer. He's not certain yet. And he said a few more months before he can be sure. The fire, the storm, the lamp going steady. Carter sat with this for a long moment, the full weight of it, what it meant and what it required, and what it changed about the shape of the days ahead. And he was not a man who processed large things quickly, because large things required the same careful attention that all important things required. And he had learned not to shortchange the processing by rushing to a response. And what he felt, working through it honestly, was not the complicated mix he might have expected. It was simpler than that. It was the feeling of a future that had a shape again. And after 3 years of a future that had been only duration, only one day following another, without form or direction. And shape was not a small thing. Shape was what made duration into time worth living. He said, We'll build on the north side of the house in the spring. There's room. The foundation can go in when the ground breaks. She looked at him. And the kitchen needs a bigger window anyway, he said. It's always dark in there by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A sound came from her that was not quite a laugh, and was not quite something else, and was both at the same time. And it was the first time he had heard her make that sound, and he discovered that it was a sound that expanded the available air in a room already full of firelight and storm, and the solid weight of two lives that had found each other across a distance no one had planned correctly, but that had delivered them here anyway. And he reached across the space between the chairs and put his hand over hers, where it rested on the chair arm. And she turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that, hands held in the firelight, while the storm spent itself against the walls, and the house held itself together around them, the way things built to last will do. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but with the total conviction of a structure that knows its purpose and has been given the materials to meet it. The fire burned lower. The wind outside found other places to push against. And the lamp held its small, steady circle of yellow in the dark. And inside that circle, and in that room, and in that house on 840 acres of Colorado hill country that did not welcome you but allowed you to exist on it for as long as you proved worth the trouble. And two people sat with their hands held and let the night go by. And the storm broke before dawn. When Carter rose in the first gray light and went downstairs, the world outside the windows was silent, in the way of a world that has finished what it came to do. And the snow lay deep and unbroken in the yard, the fence posts crowned with it, the barn's roof carrying 2 feet that would need to come off before noon, or the weight would start to matter. The sky above the eastern ridge was the pale color that preceded the sun by half an hour. And clear. The storm had moved through and taken its business with it, and left the country scoured and quiet and prepared for whatever came next. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and watched the light change over the ridgeline by degrees. And pale to rose, rose to the first real gold that broke across the snow and made everything on which it fell briefly brilliant, the kind of brilliance that doesn't last, but while it lasts is complete. 840 acres of it. And from where he stood to the far fence line, and beyond to where Bristle Creek ran under its ice. all of it holding the light, the way good country holds what it's given, fully and without waste. And he heard her on the stairs. He heard her cross the kitchen floor. And she appeared beside him at the window, in her dark wool dress, with her braid not yet pinned, the morning version of her, the one he had come to know as the truest one, because it was the one she had not yet organized for the day's requirements. And she looked out at what he was looking at. She said, "The east pasture fence is down at the corner." And he said, "I see it. Cattle will drift before noon. I'll go out after coffee." She poured her own cup and came and stood beside him at the window. And they looked at the broken fence and the brilliant snow, and the ridge going gold in the morning light, and everything that needed doing was clear and specific and would be done. And everything that mattered was inside the walls of this house, and inside the land that surrounded it, and inside the spring that was coming, whether or not the weather had yet committed to the fact of its own arrival. And he said, without looking away from the window, "I'm glad Doc sent that letter." And she said in the same tone, and looking at the same window, "So am I." And the sun came fully over the ridge. The snow in the yard blazed white and then settled into its true color as the eyes adjusted. The clean blue shadowed white of a morning after a storm, particular and temporary and exactly what it was. And Carter finished his coffee and put the cup on the counter and went to get his coat and his boots. And the ranch received the morning the way it received all mornings, as a thing to be met with full attention. Nothing withheld, nothing saved back for easier conditions that might not come. The land did not welcome you in Harrow Valley, and it simply allowed you to exist on it, and only for as long as you proved worth the trouble. Carter Hale was still proving it, and now, so was she.